We are the Rebels, and we're back together. It feels like it's been a few weeks since we've had a podcast with the two of us, but it is P. Nate and Elder P. Rebel podcast. We're kind of doing a mid-season, I was going to say, mid-series review of kind of how the series is going. What's your highlights? What's your takeaways so far for the series, How to Change the World? And we are the Rebel podcast with the Fight Last Peace Network. Nate, how are you doing today, my friend?
I'm doing great. Yeah, it has been a while, and it feels weird you and I recording like virtually because you and I have always podcasted like in the same room together, and now Here we are trying to accommodate the desires of the people to see our ugly mugs, and we are doing video podcasting. So here we are. Is this us selling out?
Yes. That is correctly exactly.
As long as we're aware of it, I feel like that's. So yeah, we are Rebel Podcast, part of the Fight Last Peace Network, a ministry of the Ezra Institute, and we've been in the middle of this series, How to Win the World, which I think has been the best podcast series ever done. And because it's been so good, we decided that what we were going to do, we're kind of between some interviews. We're going to do, like you said, a mid-series review. Think about this as like the all-star break. And we both obviously made the all-star team. So here we are recording during the break. And we're going to kind of break down some of the highlights from this series because we are 7 podcasts deep. This series has been 7 podcasts. Can you believe that? And so we're just going to kind of walk through the podcast, the guests that we've had, what we've learned, maybe a takeaway or two from the podcast series, and just kind of break it up a little bit with what I know our listeners have learned to love is just you and me bantering and talking about gibberish.
Perfect. They're also going to realize that once the podcast is over, I forget everything that we've talked about. So
try to disguise it well. I'll try to jog your memory, but we'll figure it out. So, all right. Well,
you've probably had this happen to you before where somebody came up and said, "Oh, I was listening to the podcast and you guys said this," and you're like, "We did?" I have no clue that's what we talked about.
That was like the other day. You remember Ben Emery, who's now on staff at the church. He's up there and he talked about how you and I made fun of him on the podcast. And I'm like, I don't remember that at all. But he definitely like got us back from the front of the church over it. So I don't remember making fun of him, but
You don't remember it either, but when I heard what we had said, I was like, yeah, I would say that. So
yeah, that's right. That's usually how it goes. You said this, like, I don't remember saying that, but it does sound like something I'd say. Or usually if it's something bad, I'm like, that doesn't sound like me. It sounds like Chris.
People don't also, the podcast was just started completely so you could pin everything on me.
Yeah, and it's worked. I feel like no mud ever sticks to me. It always sticks to Chris. So he's my mud monster. He's the Swamp Thing of Crossroads for anybody who's nerdy enough to get that reference. All right. You ready for this?
Yes.
All right. Well, okay. So just for way of reminder, so the series is called "How to Win the World." What we're looking at is I guess it's not necessarily doctrines, but various Christian things, very practices, doctrines, or right practices that Christians ought to involve themselves in that lead to God winning the world. We believe that the world is winnable, and that's where we started the series. So the first episode was actually an episode that you weren't in on the interview. I did this one with Josh Howard, who's the one of the hosts from Eschatology Matters. He's a pastor down in Battle Creek, Michigan. And I did the first episode with Josh Howard on first step to winning the world is believe that the world is winnable. So that was my introduction to Josh. I'd been on his podcast prior to that, but it was the same week. So I just met Josh, great guy. You weren't on that podcast, so I missed you on it, but I know you caught up on it. So, let's talk about believing the world is winnable.
Yeah, I think that's the premise of everything we do. I would say, I often say at Crossroads, the 2 pillars that our church is kind of built on, obviously, is God's sovereignty in all things and our optimistic belief of Christ's victory in the world. Yeah. And everything we do is based on those things. So like you don't have to agree with those 2 pillars, but knowing and understanding that those are the pillars, kind of everything we do is in ministry is built on helps us. And we do that simply because we actually do think we take all the verses of the mustard seed will grow into a tree that covers the whole world. That the knowledge of the glory of the world will cover the world as the waters cover the sea. Sorry, I'm a bit ill, so I'm fumbling my words. But we take those verses literally. We think that Christ will win and accomplish this world. And what was unique and what I appreciate about the conversation, now it was a while ago that I heard it, but was that it's refreshing when Christians live in a way that applies Christ's power not just internally to their salvation, but also externally to the world around them. To say that things like abortion, things like liberal agendas, or whatever the current evil of the day is. So ours, I would say, would be really just anthropologic answers like what is man, who is man, what is, like, those are kind of the big cultural battles. And when you start to apply like the idea that Christ can win this world to those things, those arguments kind of get defeated because Jesus was a man and he said there's a man and a woman. Those things can be put under the foot of Christ and they will be put under the foot of Christ. So it changes just the way you even interact with those arguments.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that was a lot of words.
Yeah, no, that's good. And Josh was obviously drawn a little bit from his book, which is called "The Exorcism of Satan," and he was just talking about the, just all pointing to a lot of the prophetic passages and a lot of the promises that Christ gives during his earthly ministry about the defeat of Satan, and just really how that's sort of irreconcilable with the view that somehow this world is going to be forfeited to Satan, that he's the one who's actually going to inherit the earth. And so this idea that God is not going to abandon his good creation to his enemies, but he's actually going to uproot his enemies, judge his enemies, and allow his people to inherit his good creation. And he's going to redeem his creation, not destroy his creation. And so I think that's definitely where it starts. And obviously, I thought Josh was very charitable to other eschatological positions. But at the end of the day, it's less about your view of the millennium, though we think that's important. And obviously, we come down on the side of postmillennialism. But more so than that is the optimism that you have about, as you were saying, how many enemies can we defeat this side of the end of history? And I think that any Christian who engages culture like they're going to win, right? So any Christian, regardless of you, and Francis Schaeffer is the kind of famous example of the premillennialist who fought, just as hard as any postmillennialist in terms of cultural issues, who fought statism, who fought, a lot of the climate alarmism of his day, which looked a little different than ours. But the idea there is that if you engage culture in such a way that you believe that Christ will win the culture, that what we're moving towards is a Christian culture, and that as regenerate people can actually create a Christ-honoring culture, then you're an ally, and you're working towards Christ's ultimate victory over the world.
Yeah, I often say, particularly in like membership classes and stuff, is that I don't actually care if we disagree on the details of how the millennium, like when the millennium is going to end, or how. What I care about more is the day-to-day optimism that you live in, right? So
yeah.
We have good friends who disagree with us on the details of eschatology all the time, but they're with us in protest. They're with us when we campaign, when we call MPs, and they fight just as hard, if not harder, than some post millennials we know, because it matters more about those things. The other thing that I thought was interesting about what you said at the start of when you were talking there was the optimism that we, obviously podcast about, that we talk about a lot, that our church ministries are kind of built on, pushes back on this idea that Christians kind of let seep into their lives that Satan is an equal and opposite force of Christ. You know what I mean? Like that, like he has some sort of creational power, that he can do miracles, that he can do all these things. And it's like nowhere in Scripture are those things said. The Scripture is very clear that Satan will be defeated, and it's like, but we live oftentimes as Christians thinking that's not going to happen, that he's actually going to beat us. And it's like, that's just a mind shift that I think actually unhealthily hurts a lot of Christians, because you don't overcome every temptation in your life, because sometimes you would say, well, the devil made me do it. You know what I mean? Like I'm tempted too much by Satan. It's like, no, well, Christ gave us victory over all of that stuff. And so I just think it's helpful when you start putting him in his place, basically.
Yeah. Or recognizing that Christ has put him in his place, right? And like
Yeah,
actually
that's a better
walking
way to put it.
in the
Yeah.
reality of that. So from there, we went to our second series. I know we're kind of flying through this, but we 7 interviews deep. So let's keep moving here. Obviously, our second one was with one of the most influential guys to either of our ministries, and that's Doug Wilson. We brought Doug Wilson on, and it was How to Win the World. We war with our worship. And we talked to him about what worship is and what that looks like. I thought that was a great interview. Like, we've had Doug on. I think that was our 3rd or 4th time having him on the show in the 7 or 8 years that we've been doing this show. My goodness. And, but I thought that was one of my favorite ones because I feel like we kind of, everybody talks to Doug about cultural engagement. Everybody talks to Doug about post-millennialism. I felt like we asked him questions that got him into what I think is a great wheelhouse of his, but that's sort of underutilized with how prolific his writing and his podcasting and his conference talks are. I don't think people ask him to talk about that topic much. And I think he just knocked it out of the park.
Yeah, it was a great episode. I noticed in that chat, and maybe it's because we're a little more comfortable with him than we were the first couple times we interviewed him, because there's been a couple other interactions we've had with him over the years. But what I thought was interesting about that one is that we kind of got him to be on pastoral. You know what I mean? So he kind of put on his like how he would kind of talk to his church family, and I actually think sometimes guys, particularly at like Doug's level, Joe Booth's level kind of thing, they kind of get pigeonholed into like everybody wants them to come and talk about postmillennialism. Everybody wants them to come talk about like, No Quarter November or
rules for reformers kind of stuff.
Like those kind of things. And I know how often I get asked the same question about certain things, and it's like, I can talk about other things. You know what I mean? Like,
I know other stuff.
Nice. Not very many, but I mean, like, you kind of want to sometimes hear other passions of people. And so, what was great about that interview was like obviously how the body of Christ worships, the way what our worship is, what's happening in the gathering, the essential aspects of the gathering, what's actually transpiring in terms of like, is it just we go and do that on Sundays, or what is actually happening cosmology? Why is that way? I can't even talk, but was really great to see, because it wasn't him just being like, oh, well, here's my 7 points that I give everywhere about why postmillennialism is great, which are all awesome, and I would recommend you go listen to those things. But it was nice to talk to him about something I don't think many people talk to him about.
I walked away from that. I remember listening to it afterwards, and oftentimes when you're in an interview, you're kind of in the interview, you're getting the answers, but I don't always go back and listen to our podcast. It's a exercise in self-loathing. But when we have a guest on and it's interview and somebody else is doing most of the talking, then I often do. And I feel like I track with it a little bit more when you can just listen to it as opposed to when you're engaged in it. But one of the things I really found with going back and listening to that is that if every pastor in North America, if every pastor on the world had listened to that podcast episode prior to the COVID pandemic, I think there would have been a lot of churches that took different stances. Right. He elevates the corporate worship of the church to a point that I just don't think many people do. And we talked a lot about how we've fallen into this trap of thinking that church on Sunday mornings is more like a seminary and it's just to teach people about the Bible. And if that's true, then Zoom church is just as can be just as successful in accomplishing those goals. But if there is actually something different, and he talked about how believers are in two places at one time, just like the Ephesians that Paul's writing to. They are the saints in Ephesus, and they are also seated with Christ in the heavenlies at the same time. And so when we are gathered as God's corporate people, worshiping him as he's prescribed, and we got into regulative, normative principle stuff, and I thought he had some really helpful things to say about that. But just that premise, that when we gather together physically, corporally, incarnationally, that it actually does something in the heavenly realms. There's something spiritual that takes place there, and it actually invites the Spirit of God to come and do battle with the forces of darkness around us. And I just think that's an aspect. It's often we leave the idea of spiritual warfare, we leave up to the charismatics, and a lot of Reformed people kind of look down their noses at that. But essentially, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about spiritual warfare, but like Reformed spiritual warfare is the idea of proper worship, properly aligned worship by God's covenant people, renewing covenant with him. And I actually found a lot of people, particularly people who have similar convictions to us in terms of Reformed, they're trying to be biblical, all that kind of stuff, but don't necessarily have a liturgical outline to their worship service. I heard from a lot of pastors who found that interview with Doug, where he explained covenant renewal worship and what that is and what we're doing by it and why we think that's a thing, is so important. So I thought that was a really helpful interview for a lot of those reasons.
Yeah, it was really good. What I found interesting, I feel like you could say that about almost all of these episodes, like because when you said about if people would have listened to this before 2020, I think the outcome of many churches would have been different. And I think the Rigney interview, I think that would be true for. Definitely the Rachel interview. So Doug's at least. So I was just like, I feel like we could say that about the whole series. And that I don't mean that in like a look at how good we are, but I mean because of what they're saying is so profoundly impactful.
Well, that's actually an interesting point because we're talking about winning the world. And at the end of the day, I would just say that the church's absolutely abysmal reaction to the pandemic actually lost us ground. Right. And I think it was an opportunity for the church to gain ground. And instead, the church universal lost ground. I think there are churches that faithfully weathered that storm, and they've grown, and they've grown as a result of it. But I think the church as a whole lost ground during that time, and we could have gained it. Now, obviously, God is sovereign over all things, and obviously he's strengthening particular faithful communities for a purpose, and we're excited about some of those purposes. But I do hear what you're saying. So from Doug's interview, we went on to part 3, which was Toby Sumpter, and we talked to him about cultivating Christian community. I thought, I'm biased here, and I'm just talking about how much I've loved this series, which I have. I feel like this is in some ways been a very selfish series for us, because it was like you and I not just trying to talk about things that are topical, or like let's get somebody from Moscow wanted to talk about the Moscow mood because that's all the rage, so we can get some clicks. This was actually just like you and I, like what do we want to talk to these people about? Like, what are the things, if we could talk to Toby about anything, if we could talk to Doug about anything, like what would it be? And so I feel like you and I have learned a lot in this series, and it's confirmed a lot of things that we already held dear to our hearts. And it's, I think, also helped us in a lot of ways. But this interview with Toby, I thought was so impactful, because obviously, like as two pastors at Crossroads Bible Church in Ingersoll, we are trying to cultivate the kind of community that we see in Moscow. So we want to get at one of our peers. Toby's been a great friend and a good ally. And so we brought him on to kind of pick his brain, just say, what's made Moscow what it is? And I just thought it was really, really simplistic that he just said, you know what, it's really about, and I don't know if he said this phrase or it was a phrase that was sort of born out of that interview. One of the guys in our church said it, and I thought, that's it. It's a community of people with calloused hands and clean hearts. And a community with calloused hands and clean hearts can accomplish anything. And just the way he drove home repentance and confession and living, with a clear conscience before one another cultivates the kind of ingenuity and entrepreneurial activity that we want to see. But he says, don't pursue those things. Those are the ends. The goals are live together with clean hearts. And I just thought that was honestly, it was something I needed to hear.
Yeah, it was such a practical interview too, because I don't know if the outside impression is always that like Moscow is kind of like I think most people who think about it would think like Doug's sitting in his office kind of controlling everything, like not because he's domineering or anything, just because they've thought through everything. They've got a book for everything. There's Canon Press, there's this, there's a, if you're questioning it, they have a podcast on it somewhere, I'm sure.
Right.
You know what I mean? And what I found was super interesting when Toby was talking, was kind of more like, no, we just had a principle, and that principle actually came from Jim Wilson in his book, The Principles of War. And they've just been living that out for 40 years. Yeah. And it's a lot less I don't even know the word I'm looking for. Like a lot less mandated or controlled is probably a
Yeah.
poor word for it, but and more just like people just understand that the way our culture works is if I offend you, I ask for forgiveness. We we reconcile. There might still be consequences, so that we can take the Lord's Supper together on Sunday
Yeah.
and live as Christians Monday through like Saturday kind of thing. And it's the idea of like the church itself isn't involved in the day to day business of the people. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
they're not like, hey, getting involved between plumber A and plumber B because they're upset about something. You know what I mean? If they sin, they'll get involved. But
Right.
like other than that, work it out, boys. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
and it's just like it was
What was the
refreshing
phrase he kept
because
using? Time to put on your Christian big boy pants.
exactly. Well,
Yeah.
it's refreshing because like I think as leaders, oftentimes we get ourselves involved in far more minutia and um, interpersonal issues than we even need to. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
I would
Like
agree with that.
you two just work this out, come to the Lord's table. If it gets past the point where you can't reconcile through Matthew 18, get us involved. But until then, I don't need to hear about it. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
and then I also thought was interesting, was interesting was I can't remember if you or I asked them a question about just like how much involvement Doug has in the ministry, and his response was like, "We kind of wish he'd had more, but like people just do stuff, and
Yeah.
it's great." Like,
It kind of spoke to me that like one of my takeaways from that was like as a leader, as a pastor, it's our job to almost be like the cultural architect of the church, set the culture of the church and lead by example. We talk about that all the time at Crossroads, right? Like be worthy of imitation, lead by example. But the idea there is like if we are prioritizing, clean hearts, confession, repentance, and we model that in our families, in our church life, and with our relationships and with our friends, then that sets a tone, that sets a culture within the church. And if everybody's doing that, then the atmosphere is such that like businesses and ministry ideas and community involvement just kind of spiral out of that because you're not so distracted with the petty conflicts that come between Christians who have things against one another. So I just thought that was really
yeah,
profound.
yeah, it's funny. It's funny. I can't remember when this was said, so forgive me. But it's like the idea of like when you live with a clean heart, it's easy to produce something that's good and glorious for the kingdom, like a new business or a new relationship or whatever. Because when you live with guilt, you're kind of an impotent person. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
because you're always worried that what you're guilty of is going to be found out. It's going to
Right.
be brought forward. It's going to ruin whatever you're doing. It's going to poison the tree that you're building. Um, but when you live guilt free, even if the endeavor that you undertake doesn't succeed, you have a clear conscience of the fact, well, you know what, I tried. That business
Yeah.
didn't take off. I'll try something else. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
because you don't have any shady dealings in the background. There's no burnt bridges with people along the way. And one of the interesting parts of that chat too is when Toby was talking practically about like, if somebody stole from him as a business owner, he's like, if he came and repented, he's like, I might keep him. But if he came and repented, I might also be like, and be completely just to be like, you're forgiven. I'll see you Sunday, but you're fired. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
and that just, I know, I was like, oh yeah, that's like, sometimes as Christians, we forget that consequences are still fine. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it's just that there's no punishment or condemnation for the punishments. But if you suck at your job, I can still fire you and still love you as a Christian brother. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
interesting.
That actually kind of leads into the fourth interview, which I thought they complemented each other quite well. We had C.R. Wiley on. And honestly, like I felt like I don't know how you felt in that interview. I love talking to Wiley. I think that he like I walked out of that interview just being like I wish he was my dad. Like this guy, you know what I mean? Like it's just he's just such a great guy, and like he just seems like he's got so much practical wisdom, and he seems to take so much joy in his family. And obviously, like I think one of his grandkids was there in the background. Like he just seems like such a down to earth. He's the kind of dad and the grandfather that I kind of aspire to be. And so, but we had him when we were talking about recovering biblical households. And so we talked a lot about, the productivity of the ancient household, the idea that when the Bible tells households to be a particular way, we lose something in translation because our homes aren't what they used to be, right? They used to be education centers and place of commerce and business and entrepreneurial activity and all this stuff, but now they aren't. They're not the same productive. They don't even have the same number of people because there used to be, servants and household, workers and all this kind of stuff. But now we're so insular and it's so nuclear, and even the nuclear family. I mean, I had to chuckle where he's like, you know what? TV actually didn't used to be as bad of a thing as it was because it brought you together. You're all in one room, but now everybody goes off to their own rooms, their own screens, their own things. Like it was just very interesting talking to him. But sorry, I should let you talk, but I had one particular takeaway that I took from there that I thought was really interesting.
Hit me. I'll jump off it.
Yeah.
I'm sure.
Well, what I was going to say is like when he was, and he didn't do this in at all a boastful way. Like I find him a really humble guy, but he was talking about like how many revenue streams he has in his home. And he wasn't saying it boastfully. He didn't even, I don't know how big those revenue streams are, but the point is like, in order to be anti-fragile, the more revenue streams you have coming into your home, the stronger your household is. Because if a particular industry goes down, right? So like he's into real estate, and if interest rates are spiking as they are right now in Ontario, and the market stalls out, well, you're not as affected by that because that's only one of multiple revenue streams that you have. And he was talking about being a pastor, and basically like, during COVID, there were probably some people who made wrong decisions because it would have cost them their livelihood, their pension. They wouldn't have been able to take care of their family. So just that idea that you're not beholden to a particular person or a particular board or a particular boss, it almost grants you the freedom to be strong in your convictions and be a man of conviction, because you can just say, no, I'm not going to get that jab. No, I'm not going to wear that mask. No, I'm not going to do that thing, because you've actually insulated yourself from the ability that the outside world has to bring ruin into your home. So I just found that very convicting and very inspiring.
Yeah, I found it super like interesting too, because like I've read a lot of Piper, and I've read a lot of like from his school of thought of like almost wartime living. Like pastors should like almost be in poverty, so to speak,
Right.
like
Yeah.
sacrificially like and what's funny is like Wiley's kind of like, he's not, again, I don't want to put words in his mouth, and I don't think he's saying like go build yourself an empire of like mega money or anything like that. But if that happened because you started a business that took off, okay, like that's fine.
Yep.
Like you haven't done anything wrong to have money coming in. And so I just found that like really interesting. And then like, it kind of bumps up against a lot of the train of thought in Eva, like in Big Eva, basically, like, your pastor's like down with the CEO pastor, down with the idea that like somebody can just be competent at their job. You know what I mean? They must be like sacrifice or just be like non-skilled people. And it's like, no, like it's kind of great if you have a pastor who's also good at real estate. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
why is that a problem? You know what I mean? Like, why is it bad if your pastor's good at business? You know what I mean? Like, now if it's hurting his ministry, probably a bad idea, but like, it doesn't necessarily need to. And I thought what was really interesting with CR is like, he kept being like, I don't know how many revenue streams, but like my son does this one, and my grandson or my nephew does this, or I can't remember who the people were, but like, and it was like, oh, so like what you've actually done is the Old Testament household, just not living all in the same property. You know what I mean? Like the sons have taken shares of your estate. They're running with those to grow it even further. That's awesome. And then what I agree with you too. I found that part about like when we talked about with him, just the idea of like there are fiscal realities in our world that sometimes mean we make decisions that we might not have otherwise or even considered otherwise, right? Like you're like, and having the ability to be like, I don't need the paycheck from X person, so I don't need to please them. I can just do what I think is right in all circumstances. Is an unbelievably freeing thing, if you think about it. And I was thinking about after the interview, it's where you sparked this in my brain. I was thinking in the like, that to me is where the idea of a denomination comes in. Like, and so like it should almost be like senior pastors are kind of paid or like from the denominate. Like, no, I'm not saying they necessarily should, but I was like the idea of like, you get a flock who might not be faithful and might be like, we need to close for COVID. I'm just using COVID as an example.
Yep.
And the pastor might have to do that because they pay his salary. Whereas like if there was a strong board of like denomination behind them being like, no, you do what you think is right. Or like in this case, you stay open because that's right. If they fire you, well, we've got your back kind of thing. And I was just thinking it was like that idea of like, um,
That could work the other way
I,
though too, right? Like you might have
100%.
an unfair, right? Because bureaucracy always tends to shift to the left, right? So I mean, it could work in the other way too if the denomination is unfaithful and then they're taking a faithful pastor out, which we saw a
Well,
lot of during COVID as
yeah,
well.
we
But
saw that with our friend. Right?
yeah,
Yeah.
but no, yeah, it did. This is what I liked about all these interviews. To be honest with you, I felt like each guy we had on said things that were fairly unique, and it did spark a lot of good conversation. Like I think you and I have had a lot of great conversation. I've had a lot of great conversation with some listeners, particularly in our church, who are like, "Oh, I listened to this interview. This is what it made me think of." So I think there was a lot I think to be learned from some of these guys. Okay,
The nice thing with the Wiley one, sorry to jump back
no,
in,
go.
is uh, I think a lot of like for particularly Toby and Doug, what were the conversations were good for everybody, but they were particularly good for church leadership. Like they were
Yeah,
particularly good for people who are in, small group ministries, stuff like that. What was super interesting about the I would actually say the next two interviews, CR and Rachel,
yeah,
is that they actually went and like a pastor should become anti-fragile, but every man who has a
that's right.
like
Yeah,
can apply all of those same principles. It's for
yeah,
all of us. You know what I mean?
yeah.
Like we all need that idea to become anti-fragile. And just that idea of like, how many times when you were growing up did somebody say to you, be your own boss? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like don't work for somebody else. Come be your own boss. And it's like none of us actually like not none of us, but very few people actually ever do that. You know what I mean? And
Yeah,
it's like you can work for somebody else and still become anti-fragile because you have other revenue streams because you're taking the resource that this person's given you and turning it into something else over here. I
totally.
mean,
Yeah.
people probably can't see the hand gestures to know that I'm talking with my hands, but I
Yeah.
was just thinking about that idea of like, it's not bad to be Robin Hood, steal from the liberals to give to the church in other ways, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's just
Yeah.
good, good interview. I really enjoyed that
Yeah,
one.
me too. Me too. Um, and then you mentioned it. Probably one of both of our most enjoyable interviews that we did through this series. But even just as as podcasters for a number of years now. Anyway, we had Rachel on. It was awesome. Rachel Yankovic.
Very few like so. I know we talked about this right after I correct me if I'm wrong for you. I had never spoke to her before. I was
Yeah,
even
no,
not sure I was saying her
I
name right.
exchanged an
Like,
email or two with her. That's about it.
yeah. So with that, like whenever you're talking to somebody who you don't know really well, there's always that like moment of like, this is kind of awkward. I don't know how to like talk and like how like. And what was interesting about Rachel is that like that I don't know what happened, but it just like was all of a sudden like we're just chatting with somebody we like. If she was like somebody who just came to our church, it would have been like we had just somebody in our church on the podcast and we were just chatting with them,
Yeah, it was
and
very
so like
comfortable.
it became like super like easygoing is kind of the wrong word, but like I kind of forgot we were recording when we were doing it. And then
Yeah,
she said some things that I was just like, I've gone back to in my brain like 10 times. The one that is like, that keeps coming up is probably the one that she'll hate that I brought up again. But she pointed out where it's like, when you're at somebody's house and their kids are misbehaving and everybody pretends like it's not happening. And you're just like, and all you want to do is be like, are you going to deal with this? Because I just did VBS at the church, and there was multiple times where I was like, "I'm literally just going to talk to your parents." Like, it's like,
you're a nightmare, and your parents need to know that.
and I was just like, that is like that whole idea of like help people discipline their children is like brilliant. And then just I found it unbelievably helpful um, because like hospitality, because it is a command particularly for elders to be hospitable, and just kind of breaking down the idea of like there are many different veins of hospitality, and there are like it's okay if your hospitality for a season shifts to your kids and shifts to
Yeah.
your, your loved ones. And it's also okay if hospitality's got a defined time. We're
Yeah.
going to do hospitality from 1 till 3. You know what I mean? Like, so it's just like, because like,
Be super hospitable between these hours. We always there was our small group always used to laugh about so my wife's name is Colleen, and she's very hospitable, like to a particular time, and she goes to bed early, and so they always joke they saw this pillow that they all wish they had a bought for her. They saw this pillow at some like home decor store where it was like so glad you're here, welcome, so glad you're here, please leave by 9 or something like that. And it was just like that's Colleen. It's just like, at 9 o'clock, I don't turn into a pumpkin, but I'm done. But yeah, no, I thought for Colleen, who obviously like she loves Rachel, she listens to her podcast, she has read her books and stuff. She really loved that interview for a lot of those same reasons. That idea that like there are seasons of your life where it's really hard to be hospitable, and a lot of women, in particular women, carry around guilt associated with not being hospitable enough, and so almost that permission to like you need to be hospitable to your family first. Your family is actually your closest neighbors. And then the other thing that I thought was really freeing, and it was just honestly, it was a paradigm shift in my own mind, where she's just like, and it seems so simple, like I'm almost embarrassed to admit that it was a paradigm shift for me, but she's just like, hospitality is not for the person that you're being hospitable to, right? Hospitality is for Jesus. So like if they don't like the meal, if they don't like the whatever, if it's an awkward time because there were strings attached, if they're like whatever, it wasn't for you anyway. So I have no vested interest. I want you to have a nice time. I hope you have a nice time, but like I don't need you to have a good time because this actually wasn't about you. It was about Jesus. And I'm like, wow, that's so freeing.
yeah. Yeah, that was good. I completely forgot you had said that. To be honest with you, into it right now, and I was like, "Oh yeah, I did love that."
Yeah,
And like, how true is that, right? Like, we often like how many times in Scripture does it tell us like, "Don't seek the approval of man." You know what I mean? Like, and then
totally.
we think, "Oh, if I burn the chicken, I haven't been hospitable because I screwed it up." You know what I mean? It's like, well, no, I'm doing this all for the glory of God. And sometimes that means I'm going to have people in my home that I maybe aren't going to do again. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
just because we don't click. And like I also found like she mentioned like the idea like it's okay if you're not best friends with everybody. You know what I mean? Like like there's no command that says you must be great friends with everybody. The command is to be hospitable. You know what I mean? So like, which was really awesome. I just thought it was really a freeing episode overall, because it also like I don't know if I can't remember how she said it or if it was even said or if it was just kind of an undertone through the whole thing. But the idea of like we put a lot of pressure on ourselves for how does the house look? Is the laundry put away? Like all these things. And yes, you want to keep a good home and all that stuff. I'm not saying that those things are wrong, but like they are wrong if we stop being hospitable because X happens in our house. And obviously there's practical realities, but and it's just the idea of like if somebody's going to not have a good time because you know the temperature in the house was a little bit off for them or whatever, right? Like I'm just making an example. It isn't about them anyway. So who cares? You know what I mean? Like, and so just really interesting, really interesting interview. Yeah, I loved it. I don't know if I've ever geeked out about an episode as much as I like. I don't know if I've recommended that episode. I don't know if I've ever recommended an episode more than I've told people to go listen to that one. And like it's rare for me. Like we finished, and I was like, I actually want to go re-listen, and I never re-listen. Like I hate my voice, so and I have a stupid mustache. So, like,
But one of the things that I'll never forget that she talked about is how, and obviously she's grown up as a pastor's kid, as a pastor's grandkid. She's grown up in the church, like ministry has been a constant part of her life forever. And here's Rachel saying, I've never done anything that's prompted people to ask me about the hope that's in me more than being hospitable. And right when she was telling that story of like, just doing like kind of outlandish hospitable things, like going to the park with a bunch of ladies and all their kids and bringing extra food and inviting families that are in the park that they don't know to come and eat hot dogs with them and stuff like that. And she's like, and people come up and be like, excuse me, can I ask you about the hope that is in you? Like, and she's like, that for verbatim, this has never happens. Like, that's what most people wait for, but it never comes. And she's like, except sometimes in that realm of hospitality, because we live increasingly, especially us. And I would say this is very true for us in Canada, even more so than maybe some of our listeners in the southern states. We are not hospitable. We are a back porch, private fence kind of society, and so radical hospitality and actually opening your home to people is radical enough that it begs that question. So, yeah, I thought that was great. The next interview was Dr. Joe Rigney. You weren't there for that particular interview. I was sorry that you missed that one because I know how much you loved that book. You gave me a few questions that you wanted me to ask him, but that was awesome. I just found I've never interviewed Joe before, Joe Rigney, and I've never talked to him. I've heard him speak at a few conferences and stuff. I've never met him before, and I just felt like he's just a very thoughtful, very wise, very practical guy. You know what I mean? Like every answer he gave to every question I asked, it just seemed like there's just a lot of wisdom in that guy's mind. And I think I walked away from that interview thinking like, man, this guy is such an asset to the church. I'm so glad this guy is alive.
Yeah, I thought the same too. Even though I had a good, I'm going to burn you here. I had a good laugh when you were like, you're moved south or moved north, and he's like, actually, Idaho's farther north than Minnesota. I was like, Nate knows nothing about geography.
Apparently, I don't. Yeah, I also like Colleen actually made fun of me too because like I said something about like, oh, well, and then so like to try to recover from that bad faux pas, I was like, oh, Minnesota, so you must be into hockey as well. Minnesota's such a hockey town. He's like, no.
He's like,
I'm like,
no.
Okay, interview's dead. Like, let's just turn off the cameras now.
I had a good laugh. I had
Chris was like, this never would have happened if I was there.
What I was like, I was trying to think of like it probably would have went worse, like because I was like I probably would have made a joke and then it would have been awkward. But it was just funny. The start was kind of funny because then it but then it became like a great interview, right? Yeah. And it's like, and that's kind of what I was talking about with Rachel. Like when you've never met somebody before, and all of a sudden you're like, hey, our podcast is conversational. You know what I mean? It works because me and you know each other well, and so like you bring somebody else into that thing, and then like one of us isn't there, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, now it's a little bit more awkward than it's more formal than it normally is, right? And so it's
just not our vibe.
It's just funny.
Yeah.
The interview was great. The part that stuck out to me the most, and I would love to have been there to like press him give me some details on some of these, was when he talked about like we partner with churches. Like if a church has no structure and no things, it's not even a church. The first part, and then he's like, and then sometimes it's okay to partner with somebody who has cancer, like partner with something that's sick. So people who have different doctrine or whatever, but always know that cancer kills you. So like, it's just a matter of like, we're friends for a time, but like it will destroy them. You know what I mean? So like, even if they're a believer and whatnot, I was just like, and I would love to have been like, okay, like let's put on paper, tell me what your things are. Cause it was very clear that baptism to him wasn't one of those things.
Yeah.
And I would say like from our perspective that we would agree with that. Like, I'd much rather go to war with our Paedo brothers than many of our people who agree with us on baptism. But I would like to know what he would have put those die on the hill issues for. You know what I mean? I found that part really interesting. So.
Yeah, I think the thing, and I think it's partially just because I've been on this kick ever since I read this analogy in his book, right? He talked about degree, right? This social structure that holds the world together in terms of hierarchy and all this kind of stuff. But and that can seem very like, what's the word, like obviously, like I just said the word hierarchy, so obviously it can seem very hierarchical, but it can seem very like, structured, almost militant and all that kind of stuff. But then you couple that with what he views as leadership, and he was talking about King Loon, right? And that idea, like first in last out, laughing loudest. So it's like it's hierarchical, but there's this like the leaders in his mind that are leading the way and being courageous. They're the first in, the last out, but they're also laughing the loudest. And that was one sense that I got from him. So he has all this like practical wisdom, and yet he just seems like a guy who'd just be fun to hang out with. Like he really does enjoy the things of earth, right? He loves football, he loves food, he loves hospitality, he loves his family. And like there's this idea of like, one of the things a leader is, among other things, right? They're courageous, strong, unyielding in the face of compromise, all those things. But then also, they're also the most joyful people to be around. And I found that a very compelling sort of juxtaposition, because oftentimes we think of hierarchical leaders, very strong leaders, as these sort of stoic, lonely, kinds of people. And he's kind of breaking that mold.
Yeah, we've often said this just together privately. I don't know if this is offensive to people, but I would, if you were to offer us the chance to hang out with Doug Wilson or John Piper, I feel like Doug Wilson would be fun to hang out with, and John
Yeah.
Piper wouldn't be. You know what I mean? Like, and I don't mean that. I
I
don't
feel
mean
like
that
almost
like.
like fun wouldn't be allowed.
Well, and that's where I was going with that, is that idea of like there's both have a gravitas and a seriousness about everything that they do that like is a blessing to the kingdom and whatnot. But like Doug and all them, and I'm lumping like Rigney, and this is where I think he was going with that first and last out, laughing loudest, is that we often associate joy and jovialness and fellowship and fun with a softening of virtue, with a
Yeah.
softening of like, these are the things that make us,
Right.
strong and resilient and warriors for the faith, and like, and so like we picture those people who are those things, like those things that they're staunch, they don't back down, they have a backbone, they have a spine, as people who aren't joyous people. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like that, like those are the, like, again, I'm not mean to burn, but like a James White who I'm kind of afraid of and I've never met. You know what I mean? Like, kind of idea where it's like, but like Doug, Toby, Joe now, because we've now met him, and I would even throw in Knox and Gabe and like a lot of the, like Rachel, all the Moscow people. I guess we've interviewed a lot of Moscow people, but like even Cy in our own church, right? Like Cy. Uh, the thing that I think people have missed in their ministry, and why it's actually, I think, so infectious to to young men in our culture, is that they have all of the backbone, spine, um, you know, ruggedness that we want in men, that we're wired to want, and the joy of the Lord that we know we want. So they have like a freedom of like they can laugh the loudest even though they're going to war. You know what I mean? It's like they're in fights with somebody new every week, not because they start them or anything, and they're being called charlatans or whatever it is. And I get the picture that they go to work on Monday and they're having cheers with their coffee and going to work loving their people, and it doesn't matter what the world says. And like what I took from that is like um, the quickest way for us to like die as a church, die as Christians, and you hit on it when we said about Canadians are very insular people, is we let the rot into our own families. You know what I mean? Like, and so like you become critical with your spouse, I become critical with my friends, and we're not laughing loudest together. You know what I mean? Like, and so then we go out and we get torn apart by everybody because we no longer have any joy. You know what I mean? Like, and so, but and then to acquire that joy, we soften on all the other things because we'd rather live at peace with everybody around us. You know what I mean? Like, because we want that other thing. And it's like so refreshing to be like, no, you just foster that. You know what I mean? Like, and then I don't even know how to say what I'm saying, but like, like having those convictions staunch, not being led by, you know, the weakest common denominator in your church. You know what I mean? Like being okay to be like, no, you're just wrong. We're going to do this. You know what I mean? Like even if you're unpopular for doing it, can can lead to this idea of like, well, we're just joyful. You know what I mean? Like,
For sure.
his book was amazing. I wish I was in the interview.
Yeah. So the last one before we hit the midseason review was the one that I missed. So you, while I was on vacation, interviewed our buddy Corey McKenna. I actually thought you said something at the beginning of the podcast that I hope he heard. I know he's a humble guy. It's hard for him to sometimes take compliments, but like you mentioned it, like obviously we've pulled like the Rigneys and the Wilsons and the, you know, we've interviewed some awesome people. And we didn't get Corey for this just because he's the evangelism guy at our church. We actually got him because I think he's the evangelism guy I would want on the podcast talking about winning the world through seeking the lost. And so I hope he heard that because that was a great interview. He's obviously like top notch at what he does. And I thought you did a good job too, because we know him so well. Like he's our buddy. He was served with us on the elders board. We see him multiple times on a weekly basis. He's our boy. But I thought you did a good job of like, there's probably a lot that he said there that you and I have heard before, but like getting him to say all his stuff to an audience that hasn't necessarily heard him. I thought you did a really good job at that. But I mean, that was a great interview. And I hope that people listening to that interview walked away going like, yeah, I hope if they're church leaders, they're thinking, yeah, I need to give opportunities to my people regularly to be evangelizing. And I thought some of the sneaky little things that he said that were really good, talking just about the idea that churches for Christians, right? And sometimes people who are passionate about evangelism, they get that part wrong. That's where they want the church to be a bit more evangelistic. You know, every Sunday the pastor has to give a gospel call and that sort of stuff. And that's kind of arisen even in reform circles with that gospel centered movement. But his ecclesiology is spot on. And he's like, no. Every single Christian is an evangelist. And I thought he did a good job at dispelling some of the myths that it's a call, that's a particular calling. It's a gifting like pastor and teacher. And he's like, no, this is something every Christian's called to do. So I thought he did a great job.
Yeah, I enjoyed the talk. I always enjoy talking to Corey. And so one of the things we talk about often in our little outreach leadership team, which is myself, Corey, and another gentleman in our church, who actually does the intro for this podcast. So there you go. Luke, one of the things we talk about all the time is just trying to dispel the myth that evangelism is for other, like kind of like what we said about hospitality. Like evangelism isn't for the other person. It's for right. You. You know what I mean? Like we are all called to be missionaries for Christ. We're all called to be ambassadors for Christ. Our job is the faithfulness to do that calling. You know what I mean? Like, and to proclaim, to give the defense for the hope that's in you, how in whatever means the Lord has equipped you to do that. Like not everybody's going to go do it the exact same way, but we're all called to do it. But like we often think, particularly with evangelism, we think of the result as the important part. Like, oh, how many people has your street ministry converted? And I'm like, I don't know. Like, maybe none, maybe 1,000. I have no idea. Like because we're not about the results. Like we're never going to know. God's in the results business. We're not. And so it's like that mind shift to think this is far more discipleship than anything else is why I think at our church, and I would say like some of the like-minded churches like Trinity, I know does this really well. It's far more people are involved in these ministries than I've been at other churches, because the focus is inward externally, if that makes any sense. Like we're not worried so much about the results of what we're doing, but we're worried about the results that's actually having on all of us. And then again, I can't remember where we talked about it in the conversation, just that idea, like, and that's how you get the household involved in all of this. That's how this, like, it changes you as the head of the household, and your fervor for that part of your life permeates into your children, and they grow, like we all grow up with this idea that we need to expand God's kingdom into the world. And so we win the world not because we've made 1 million converts, but we've converted all the people in our lives to think correctly about this, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that was good. So we're midway through this series. We have a couple more interviews lined up that we will get to do in the next couple of weeks, and we got some more good guests. We're going to be talking about masculinity, femininity. We're going to be talking about media. We're going to talk about winning back the arts. We're going to be talking about all kinds of stuff. So stay tuned. Look forward to some more interviews, some more great episodes. And if you missed any of the episodes that we were listening to, make sure you go catch up. Send them to somebody who doesn't listen to us. And we're thankful for your listenership, and we're thankful for your support. Anything you want to say, Chris?
No, just hug a wet lover next time you see him. That's what I'm going to say to everybody.
All righty. We'll see you next time.